So that's okay, it's working. You gotta find out where, when you're a speaker at EA, you also get free dental work. So today's lecture is Uranus, the apex of humanity, and its shadows. All right. We belong to the short population. We need to be on the upper level. So, we've heard a lot of definition about Uranus. And what I'm going to try to do during this hour is to develop stages of development within this archetype so that all these fragmented definitions will have some kind of thread and we will understand where it's starting and where it's going. For example, a basic contradiction that we often hear about Uranus is that on the one hand it symbolizes individuality, and yet it is a collective sign because it belongs to the last quarter between Capricorn and Pisces. So how come we have individuality and collectivity in the same symbol, in the same archetype? And the thing is, both these definitions are true. But that's the beauty of evolutionary astrology, is that we understand the archetype through a process. It's not just a definition. There is a thread. So when we talk about where we're at right now, it doesn't mean that we're going to be there in the future. We have the same chart that follows us from birth to death. And yet, this same symbol can apply in an exactly opposite way. So you can go through your Uranian phase and feel that you don't belong anywhere and you want to individualize and separate and go your own way, so to speak, and then you will go through phases where you will need to come to an astrology conference and belong to a group in order to stimulate your creativity, because that's one of the functions of Uranus is creativity. It's opposing Leo, and it's group creativity versus individual creativity. So that's the introduction. That's what we're trying to do here and understand that. So one of the beauty also of astrology is that it is a system that was basically given to us by nature. Just like we found out that the trees are green, we also found out that Aquarius is between Capricorn and Pisces. That's just a fact of nature. So when we want to learn about something, we can simply correlate, observe and correlate, make judgment and observation. So we see that Aquarius is between Capricorn and Pisces. It's opposing Leo. What does that mean? Why is it there? What is the natural sequence of development? As I mentioned, those three last signs, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, relate to our need to develop objective consciousness. What does that mean? It's basically to reflect upon our egocentric development and to integrate all right, to integrate who we are as an ego in the greater context. The greater context can be society, it can be this group, or it can be a spiritual greater context. Why am I here from a spiritual point of view? So these last three signs are about that transcendence of the self and adapting into laws that are greater than us. And it's a function of cooperating. The ego needs to learn to cooperate through these last three signs. So we move from a mode that is personal to a mode that is impersonal through these last three signs. Now, just one note before we go on, when I talk about the signs, I talk about the archetypes. When I talk about Aquarius, I naturally talk about Uranus and the 11th house, just to make it clear. So, as I said, these last three signs relate to the impersonal process. Impersonal means that just like we saw yesterday, life does not revolve around us. We are part of a larger collective dynamic. And in order to be happy, we need to understand that larger dynamic, because happiness is our ultimate motivation after all. If we want to study, if we want to find a right partner, if we want to be fulfilled in life, if we want to learn something, the actual motivation. All right, let's have your attention back. Sorry for the interruption. We're in Uranian times now. So, to go back, our ultimate motive is happiness. And if we want, what I'm saying basically is in our desire to understand the larger context is not just because it's fun, it's not just because we are curious, it's because it's a fundamental survival need. We need to understand the cosmos. We need to understand the collective if we want a better life. And that's where Uranus is basically stimulating our creativity and our imagination. We feel the limitation, and we eventually understand that if we don't move beyond ourselves, we won't be able to resolve our problems. So we need to be smart, otherwise we will die. That's also a bottom line. Now, one of the also very accepted notion of Uranus is that it's about equality. And what we're going to find out is that it's not absolute. You will have hierarchy in the Aquarian archetype. And you will see that many Aquarian people that are basically influenced strongly by this archetype will not naturally feel equal with other people. Why? Let's start from the first stage. Where does it all begin? From a Uranian point of view, there is a strong need to belong. There is a strong need to be part of a group, of an organism that reflects values that I will adopt for myself. See that Uranus is following Capricorn. In Capricorn, we established a society in order to have a certain degree of security. We understand that we need morals in order to be able to guide ourselves. So Saturn, Capricorn is about the guide. It's about knowing right from wrong and belonging somewhere. Now, Aquarius and Uranus takes this a step further in not only having a society that allows us to feel safe and to have a future, but also a society that will stimulate creativity. So this society needs to not just duplicate itself, not just survive, but also develop. So we need collective creativity. And this is where Uranus comes and the group function starts to be formed, because what happens in the group is that you share ideas. Now, when do you form a group? When do you get out of yourself in order to meet other people that may help you in the process? It's when you feel limited yourself. So the need to merge with a collective is a feeling of inner limitations. This is why we have with Uranus the concept of friendship. What is the function of a friend? A friend takes you out of yourself. And that's the beautiful thing about a friend, is that a friend is not biologically related to you, which means they don't come with the same heritage. They don't come with the same conditioning, with the same family dynamics. So they can basically have a more objective perspective on what's going on with you. And through that, you have exchange. And you're stimulating your friend, and your friend stimulates you. And you have group creativity, which we may call brainstorming. But a very important thing to remember about that first level of experience, that group dynamic, that collective dynamic, is that when you belong to the group, you actually want to conform to the group. And that there is something about Uranus that is very much about conformity. It's belonging to the cool ones, wanting to belong to the astrology group, wanting to belong to this or that association. And you can name these groups, you have a large variety. It can be also, a teenager that wants to belong and that will follow the herd and will be actually very submissive and far from rebellious in having that Uranian quality. And this is something that you need to recognize when you counsel a client, because not everybody is ready to go through the following stages. And this is something also, from an evolutionary point of view, absolutely necessary. Why? Because when you form a group dynamic, whether it is mainstream society, whether it is a subgroup, what you do is you establish minimum standards for that group. That's one of the main function of Uranus. And if you understand that, you understand how this archetype is working. The concept is minimum standard. And this is where we relate equality to Aquarius. We are not born equal. We all come from a different time and a different space. If we didn't have time and space, we would all be equal. But we live in a different geographic location, and we are all coming from different kind of incarnations. So this generates difference within us. Still, what Uranus wants to establish from an evolutionary point of view is that the minimum standards for everybody will be relatively high, so that we will have better quality. Quality is also a Uranian word, because Uranus is about progress. That's one of the main functions. And how do you measure progress? How do you measure if a society is progressive or in decline? If the minimum standards of that society are high, you know you're in a good place. Whereas if you know that, there are possible high standards, but only a small minority enjoys these standards, it's worthless, ultimately. So when you know that the masses, when you know that the whole group is enjoying those minimum standards, you know you're in a good place, and that's the whole work of Uranus. This is why it taps into equality. So that it's not that we are all the same, but we all share those minimum qualities or privileges. Let's say, for example, we have a new concept now, having a computer for every kid at school. This is a Uranian standard to improve the minimum on the education level. Or we pass a law now that says that somebody that beats his wife will go to jail. So we increase the minimum so that at least, we cannot guarantee that everybody will be happy in a marriage, but we can guarantee that somebody that will be violent will be prosecuted, which means that the minimum standard of the quality of a relationship will exclude violence. And this is the Uranian process, wanting to increase the minimum all the time. And this is the main desire to create a group, a consensus, so that everybody will agree that violence in this society, in this group, will not be tolerated. And so we have the happy Uranian people living in their group and leading their lives and being friendly with one another, basically conforming to what has been accepted by that consensus. Usually feeling very proud to belong there. Now, what happens is that you eventually move to the second phase, where you realize that at some point you outgrow the dynamics of the group. And you feel that those minimum standards do not apply to you anymore. And you feel the limitation, which means you start to basically have an objective perspective on the group you belong to. Say you're part of this astrology group, and you're all very happy that evolutionary astrology is progressing and it's developing, and you want to have your name tag, blah, blah. Now, suddenly you start to realize that you're not happy with the way the conference is handled. You're not happy with the material. You start to reflect, Uranus, on what's going on here. And a typical Uranian thing that happens is that you start to criticize. Because when you have perspective, when you see things, you basically, it's a cerebral process where through objectivity, you realize the flaws, you realize what is lacking, what is missing. And that's a very important part of the Uranian dynamic. It's extremely critical. We tend to associate criticism only with Virgo, but that's not exclusive, because if you remember, Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. Mercury rules both Gemini and Virgo. So the criticism here has for function progress. I want to move further. I want to go beyond what we have right now. Now, what is happening in this phase is the phase of discontentment, disassociation. What do you feel? How does this happen? How do you objectify? It's interesting. We have the effect of the mirror in Uranus. And it's interesting that the mirror relates both to Leo and to Aquarius, but in a totally different way. In the Leonian way, you have the mirror to admire yourself. And through Aquarius, you have the mirror to see what's lacking and where you need to actually move beyond yourself. And how is this mirror effect operating? Is when you have a group dynamic, we're all sitting here, we're all conforming, we suddenly start to see ourselves in that group. We see the immediate responses of that group. We see the natural trends of that group. And we see all the little clones conforming to the group dynamics. And suddenly we reflect upon that and we see who we are through that perspective. We are mirrored through others. And we start to see eventually that there is something missing, and we start to criticize. Now, what is going on in the Uranian mind is these people are fucked up. They don't get it. How can they see that, this speaker is nonsense? Or how can they see that, we need this or we need that? And that's a very Uranian thought, the feeling that there's something stuck, that we need to move forward. But what I want to say is that the criticism can be extremely cruel. And it can be, but it's necessarily so, of course. But what I want to say is that you can have snobism with Uranian. attitude. And the snobism comes from a desire to be more progressive. Now, when you want to become more progressive, how do you look back? You look back at the primitive, those that don't get it, those that are stuck backwards, those that don't move fast enough. And you know, we all go through this, and we all have our share of snobism. But it's like also reflecting upon what's going on in the country. All those red states, they're totally backwards. They don't get it. And we are the progressive, and we know the solutions, and it takes a lot of time to integrate those new solutions. But the feeling is, I disassociate. I don't belong. Why? I don't want to belong. From a Uranian point of view, there is pride in feeling different, because feeling different is feeling superior. I'm not like them. I'm above. And I don't have yet solutions, but what I feel is I don't relate. And you see two Uranian stages and two radically different dynamics. In the first phase of development, you wanted to belong, you wanted to be an American. What should I do to be an American? I should eat at McDonald's, and I should... Well, there are other things too. But what I want to say is that in the first phase, the individual wants to meet those minimum standards. I want to belong, and what do I need to do in order to belong to the minimum? So in the first phase, I have to upgrade myself because I fear rejection. I fear being ostracized. I fear not being accepted by the cool ones, which can be whatever. They can be the Americans, they can be the Harley Davidsons, they can be the astrologers. What should I do to really be part of that group dynamic? And then you leave that group dynamic and you start to outgrow it. You move to the second phase and you don't want to belong anymore. And I won't say you don't want to, you just naturally disassociate. What happens through this disassociation process? Typically Uranian function is that you move from your emotions to your mind. And your mind gives you clarity. That's one of the functions of the mind, is to help you go forward. Because your mind is going much faster than your emotions. What you can understand, you cannot always do. But from a Uranian point of view, it's important to start somewhere. Let's start with understanding, and then eventually it will sink in. But that second phase of development is just about intellectually realizing that something's not quite right. Something needs to change. And this is why I mentioned that it can be cruel, because we neutralize emotions in that phase. Therefore, when we look at the red states and say they're behind, we're not going to feel compassion. We feel that they're behind and the whole country is dragged back because of that. So there's a feeling that there may even be anger in that disassociation. There may be harsh criticism, and as I said, a certain snobism. And what usually Uranian people don't understand is that it takes time for the emotions to assimilate progress. So we have a new idea, we identify what went wrong, but until the concepts are eventually sinking, it can take generations. And one thing is lacking from a Uranian point of view is patience, because they want to move forward. And what is going on here? You had a group dynamic where people were relating to minimum standards. Now you have to that second phase a disassociation. This group I don't relate to anymore. So I'm individualizing. That's where we start to individualize through the criticism and the discontentment. So what is going to happen now is that I'm starting to build a hierarchy in that Aquarian paradigm. Because in that hierarchy, I'm separating myself and I'm starting to build different classes. Classes of those who are more progressive versus those who are more primitive. And obviously the Uranian person doesn't want to belong to the primitive. So what you have in that dynamic is actually the absolute opposite of equality. But from an evolutionary point of view, it's necessarily so. So in that second phase, the Uranian person will be inaccessible. They will be rebellious, and they will be, what we may say from a Leonian point of view, very hard to impress. Typically, you have that song, "That doesn't impress me much." That's Uranus. You could do better. Why? Because, we can have that dynamic of, for example, the Leo guy comes with a guitar and is writing a new song, totally involved emotionally, thinking that this is the best love song. And it's totally subjective. And the Uranian producer comes and says, "That doesn't impress me much." Why? Because maybe, from your own personal experience, this makes sense to you, but it doesn't make sense from a collective point of view. People won't relate to this crap. And typically, another Uranian word is castration. You're totally castrating the person. But from an evolutionary point of view, necessarily so. Because that artist has to step out of their own emotional drama to realize that their song has to also answer something greater than the immediate masturbation. It has to, have some quality. And that's Uranus. I want quality. I don't want just somebody that is full of himself singing at the guitar, or somebody that is totally self-absorbed. I need something more refined. I need something that is more intelligent than that. So what is Aquarius doing, what is Uranus doing, is refining, is reworking. It's trying to take it to a higher level. And this is why we talk about the higher mind with Uranus. It's step out of yourself. It's think beyond your box, because you have to expand your creativity. And maybe you can do it on your own. Maybe you need a little help from your friends to inspire you, to give you idea. Maybe you should travel to neighboring countries and be exposed to different dynamics, but you have to step out of your private box. So in that second phase, you have the Uranian person that is inaccessible emotionally. And say you're married to that person, you're in trouble. Because, typically, let's take an example. Somebody with Uranus in the 7th house. Let's take the first stage. What would be Uranus in the 7th house in the first phase of development? You will have somebody that will want to have relationships, 7th house, according to what is socially accepted. So if in that social group, say I live in this exclusive neighborhood in California, this means I have to date a beautiful blonde. So if I have Uranus in the 7th house, I want to belong to the trend, I want to belong to the social dynamic. If I don't have that beautiful blonde, I won't be accepted. So I will do everything to cope with that minimum standard of that particular group. Totally conforming. And then eventually I'm dating that blonde. Years go by and I'm not very satisfied. Why? Because I suddenly start to see that all these friends that date this blonde are boring me to death. A typical Uranian reaction. I'm bored, and I don't relate, and there's nothing to talk about. So I go through my second phase, and I start to disassociate from what is socially accepted because of the discontentment, because of the feeling of emptiness. And what happens now in that second phase is I rebel, which means now, in order for me to date, my standards are going way up. I was disappointed. I know why. I want better. I want to progress Uranus in the area of my 7th house, which means I will not accept something average. I will not accept what everybody does because I see it didn't work. This means I will be extremely particular, which means I will be extremely discriminating, which means you will see many people with Uranus in the 7th house that will simply stay alone because nobody's moving them, nobody's impressing them, nobody is good enough for them to say, I do. They don't surrender so easily, and they will be extremely critical. You know, that guy, that woman is too, has bad smell, that person doesn't have class, that person's not educated. They will yearn for very high standards of behavior, and they will yearn for more meaningful emotional dynamics. So they won't settle for less anymore. Now, say this person is still in the marriage with a blonde, but in that second phase. What will end up happening if that person doesn't get a divorce fast is that that person will start abusing the blonde, usually verbally, because of the feeling of boredom, because of they will lose respect. Another, what we said, the castration, the feeling that they're not satisfied, so they will project that disassociation, they will project that discontentment on their partner. And that partner, they're just who they are. That's their nature, that's their evolution. And what I mean is, they can end up being humiliated by that Uranian person that will end up being very criticizing and very humiliating. It can be emotionally, it can be sexually, it can be intellectually. And gradually they will basically tear them down through verbal abuse. It starts with verbal abuse. And I'm talking about verbal abuse because Uranus relates to the mind. So that's the weapon. The Uranian weapon is a sharp tongue. The reason is, again, the Uranian person has perspective. They see the flaws. They are smart. But they are not always patient, and this can lead to these scenarios. So when you have, and you also have that word often associated with Uranus is sudden changes. Now, what does that mean? When I had a Pluto transit and I went through a sudden change too. And I had a Mars transit and I went through a sudden change too. All changes are sudden, basically. So what's the difference with a Uranian sudden change? The thing is, like we said, because the Uranian process takes you to your mind, takes you to, yeah. Because when you suddenly move from your emotion to your mind and you suddenly have the clarity that you didn't used to have, the realization is very sharp and very fast. Say, for example, you have that Uranus in the 7th house, and you go through the motions of your relationship, you adapt it to the social expectations, and you have your Uranian moment. and you see suddenly clearly, you're dining at that table with all your friends and their girlfriends, and you suddenly realize, I don't want to do this. So your mind has that clarity, and it immediately sinks into the emotions to a point where, in a typically Uranian way, there is no way back. We have to move forward to the future because Uranus relates to the future. It's progress again. I have to progress beyond this emotional dynamic. Another example that relates to that is, you remember about 20 years ago we had room-sized computers, right? Now we progressed. We found out that this is not really what we want, and we invented smaller versions. There is no way we're going to go back to a room-sized computer. This is done. So the same thing with a person facing that reality, that emotional dynamic. I realize now something new, it is sudden, and I cannot go back. And for me, it is totally clear. The problem is my girlfriend will have to process that 5 years, 10 years with the shrink. So that is when basically you can have the mind helping the emotions move forward. Say you only had the mind and you didn't have emotions, you would be forever attached to the same dynamic. You would be forever, we have this concept, forever processing. You know, going again and again, and talking about the past, and talking about the trauma, and talking about how I felt, and what he said, and why the mother said that, and didn't say that. So that's all the emotional processing, which is the square probably from Scorpio to Aquarius. And then Aquarius says, hey, move on. Enough. Enough processing. Yeah, there's more to life than this. So it's about speeding up the emotional assimilation. Because you cannot spend your life going to the psychologist. So that's again the second phase. The second phase is these fast realization, this desire to move forward, these moments of clarity that are very inspiring. And as much as you are very satisfied with your decisions, you may hurt your environment because your environment does not go as fast as you are in that particular moment. Now that phase, as I said, the Uranian people are barely tolerable during that time, just as they can barely tolerate their environment during that time. They need to isolate. They need to basically find their own path. And eventually they will move to the third phase. What is the third phase? The third phase is the phase of creativity. It's when you're beyond the criticism, you're beyond separation, you're beyond the feeling that, you know, you're moving away from something you didn't like. You start to actually find the solutions. And that's when you also access the polarity point of Aquarius, which is Leo. You start doing and not just talking, not just criticizing from your ivory tower, saying, this doesn't impress me. Now it's time to actually come with something to walk your talk. Typically, you may have people stuck in that second phase that will only be, pissed off and will not offer any alternative. So they have to move to that third phase to stimulate the creative process and actually come with something new. Now, what happened in that creative process? One of the main ways to create progress and to move forward from a Uranian point of view is to disassociate from any, I would say, to disassociate from the biological realm. Typically, what this means is moving from your lower chakras to your higher chakras. Typically, Uranus refers to the higher chakras, So what does that mean? You need to neutralize any kind of biological association. Because biological association relates to hormones, hormones relates to emotions, and emotions are eventually limited from a Uranian point of view. So you need to move beyond that in order to understand you are a greater person beyond your actual biology. Now let's say you have Uranus in your first house. First house, Mars in Aquarius, typically relates to sexuality. What happened in the first phase? First phase, you wanted to belong to the group and you performed sexually according to social expectations. You wanted to be part of the cool ones, and the cool ones were screwing around, so you did it. Then you move to the second phase and you realize, I don't relate to this form of sexuality. This is not really what I want to do. I'm not attracted to these people. I am not sexually stimulated. And you may see many people with Mars in Aquarius going through a phase where their libido crushes. They are not interested. Why? What happens emotionally is that they are disassociating from the old way of being sexual. And they may go through this phase where they are basically neutralizing their desires because they cannot intellectually and emotionally relate to that anymore. So they are in that twilight zone where there's nothing new, and yet the old is not satisfying. So what happens on a sexual level is that they cannot relate to what I'm supposed to do on a sexual level. So eventually, they become monks, or they become celibates, or they become just loners. Usually also they may feel that something is wrong with them. Because when you're not sexual, and when you're not attracted, and when you're not having that orgasm, despite the fact that you should, there's a feeling that something's not totally right with you. But moving into that third phase, the creativity is about finding a new way of being sexual so that it may answer deeper needs. And as we said, I mentioned transcending your biology. What does that mean from that Uranus in the first house perspective? What? It means, first of all, moving beyond the association with gender roles. If I have Mars in Aquarius, I will not relate to what a man should be doing according to the social norms. So I will move beyond my biology. I will move beyond the fact that I have a penis. And I will simply address myself as a human being that has senses and has certain values. I will embrace my higher mind versus my biological self, and allow my higher mind to inspire my lower self. So it's the higher chakras circulating to the lower chakras and taking the sexual expression to a new dimension, which means in this case, I don't have to be on top necessarily, just because I'm a man. And I don't have to be the one who will do the courtship. And I don't have to be the one who will be the provider, because when we talk about sexuality, it's not just what we do in bed, it's the whole relationship dynamic. So a person with Uranus in the first house will try to disassociate from any biological projection and move beyond that role. And obviously this is true to women too. Women with this symbol will not associate with the expectations of them being a woman, which means it's not because I can get pregnant that I have to clean the house all day and be in the bottom. So what you start having here is, again, you become very discriminating on your sexual through a sexual expression, and you want to find new ways of being, which means you want to decondition, and you eventually create new ways of expressing yourself. And hopefully finding a solution that will allow you to go deeper, to be more fulfilled. As we said, the motivation is happiness. So the search for happiness pushes you forward in life because you're fighting discontentment. You're fighting emptiness. Another manifestation of that, what you may have with Uranus-Mars connections, talking about transcending your biology, is falling in love with somebody regardless of their sex. If I happen to love a man, then I will be with that man. If I happen to love a woman, I will be with that woman. From a Uranus, this is why Uranus can correlate to homosexuality or bisexuality, because there is no clear identification with the biological self, which means I will be attracted to somebody for who they are and not what they are. And this is why basically you may also have, Uranian people can be attracted to something that is biologically absurd. Homosexuality is biologically absurd. I mean, the holes were not designed that way. It wasn't supposed to be like that from a biological point of view. However, from a Uranian point of view, the message is we are not just biological beings. We are also biological beings, but not just. Which means we can also work from the higher mind point of view and relate to a person for who they are and not for what they are. This doesn't mean, obviously, that every person with Uranus in the first house will be homosexual. But what I'm saying is I'm just describing this in order to give you an example of the need to move beyond the biology. And again, this is just a necessary phase for them. Now, another thing that in that third stage that can happen to stimulate progress, one of the main functions of Uranus is speed. Going faster. Why? Because when you increase speed, you basically have the potential to improve the quality too. Think about the times that we're living in. Think about the fact that we live in a much faster pace. And think about the fact that we can do much more in this lifetime, not only because we live longer, but because we do faster. Think about the fact that we go from one place on Earth to the other place in just one day, just a few hours. Now, what happens through this speeding process? We go faster and faster and faster. What do we gain in that speed? We gradually transcend time and space. Speed allows us to decrease the limitation of time and space, which means as we travel faster, we can be in more places in shorter times. Now, big deal. So what? What are we going to do with this? What is the gain in that from an evolutionary point of view? Why do we need to transcend the limitations of time and space? Because as we do this, we can tap into more complex equations and understand more complex dynamics of life, and we can learn more. You know, as we said, if you are spending a whole life processing the same dynamic over and over again, you are staying in a denser dimension. If you go faster, the density decreases. And when you decrease the density, you open up to a new dimension, and you can be inspired by new insights. So when you're speeding up, what happens basically is that you can open doors that were not accessible in a slower speed. Think about your computer. I mean, when your computer is processing very fast, you can do much more with that computer. Whereas, compared to the room-sized computer that was very slow, you couldn't do that much. Now think about the fact that we eventually, we're going faster and faster. Maybe one day, just like we're sending email in 5 seconds to the other side of the world, maybe one day we will be able to move in 5 seconds to the other side of the world. This will probably happen because as the faster we will go, the lower the density. So we will be able to basically, from a molecular point of view, disappear and reappear somewhere else. The density will be worked on, will be transcended. Now, what happens? When we increase speed progressively, we maybe one day will reach the speed of light. What happens when you attain the speed of light? Everything changes. You're not growing old anymore. I mean, it's not for tomorrow. That's just what I'm basically describing is where progress is leading. Now, what happens with that? You create new dynamics. You create new models of being. And then you move to the fourth phase. The fourth phase is when you have to test your invention, your new insight. They have to pass the test of reality. Let's say I have that same Uranus in the 7th house, and I was disillusioned by the classical way of being in a relationship, rebelled, nobody was good enough. And then I went through my creative phase and I said, what could I do to be satisfied in relationship? Maybe I will live with 20 people and have a relationship with 20 people and live in a commune. That's a totally Uranian concept, right? Non-attachment and relating to other on an intellectual level also. So that person will basically try that new model of relationship, which would be more collective relationship, impersonal relationship, as opposed to exclusively intimate. And then we move to the fourth phase. Is it working? Or am I more traumatized? It was hard enough to live with one person. Now I have 20. So through the fourth phase, we basically have to test if this is working or if this is Uranian junk. If this is a far-fetched idea that cannot be integrated, where? Emotionally. Because eventually we go up to the mind, we explore, but we have to go back to the emotions because this is where everything is happening. And if the emotions cannot adapt, if I'm wounded in that commune more than I was with that other person, the experiment failed. However, in that fourth phase, you may have success. You may be that person who tried that different thing and reached new levels of awareness and new levels of being where everybody else is way behind. You are the pioneer, and you are the only one enjoying the privilege of your courage to try. So that fourth phase is that test. You can pass the test, you can fail the test. But the important thing is that when you're in that fourth phase, you are very lonely. Because even if you succeeded, even if your invention worked, you're probably the only one who's doing it. And this is what I mean by the hierarchy. From a Uranian point of view, in that fourth phase, taken that you manage to succeed, you are on a higher level relative to the other people. And you create this pyramid complex where the more progressive you are, the less people there are. The more exclusive, the more refined, the more intelligent, the deeper, the less people you have. And this is why Uranus relates to hierarchy. And those that are in that hierarchy will higher up, will naturally feel superior. Now, what can you say about that superiority? They manage to do something that is radically different and objectively better. They manage to have a small computer and it works. Everybody's still with their room-sized computer and they have the laptop. They are objectively better and they should be proud about it. But they are objectively superior because they are higher up in that pyramid. And what happens is that this is when you move to the fifth phase. And that fifth phase is it's one of the most important from an evolutionary point of view, because this is when you experience the greatness of Uranus. As I call the name of this talk is Uranus, the apex of humanity. What you have, the transition between the fourth phase and the fifth phase, is that you basically reap the fruits of your creativity. It reaps the fruit of your originality, reaps the fruit of having been different and having gone your own way and having managed to come up with new solutions for current problems. This is why Uranus relates to, ultimately, a more sophisticated civilization. Because when you create something new, you are improving your life. When you have that laptop as opposed to the room-sized computer, your life is in a better shape. You have more privileges. You go faster. You travel more. You process dynamic faster. So you're in a better place. What I want to say is that Uranus, and this is basically will be the main focus of the next lecture. Uranus is right before Pisces and right after Capricorn, which basically means that there is a transition between Uranus and Neptune. But what I want to emphasize is that through Uranus, you have the potential to access the highest forms of creativity. Which means through Uranus, you have the highest civilization possible. What is civilization? Civilization is the fruit of human effort. What we as human beings were able to create, as opposed to what was given to us by God. God created the tree green. God did not create computers. We did. So having created computers, we changed life. We became co-creator. That's the axis Leo Aquarius. We build planes. God did not create planes. So we changed the environment. We changed the speed. We interfere with the natural setup of nature. And that's the birthright that we have as human beings, is to alter what God created. What do we do with that? From a Uranian point of view, we become smarter and smarter. And what do we do with this intelligence? we become gods. Literally. You know, science today is getting to a point where we can change everything. We can interfere with the natural setup of things, and we fight fate. We allow free will to take over. What I mean by that is through Uranus, we can attain the highest potential of creativity. We can do our best and we can change the world to be a better place. However, since we build a hierarchy and we have those people that are on top, the danger is that this minority will not associate with the masses. And typically, what you can have with the Uranian principle is higher race delusion. The feeling of superiority that becomes extremely dangerous. On the one hand, it's objective. In that particular field, you may be superior. You may be richer than everybody else in the pyramid of economy, because you have many pyramids. It's not just one pyramid. You have many pyramids. You have the pyramid of creativity, you have the pyramid of economy, you have the pyramid of whatever, knowledge. So say that you are on top of that pyramid, and you feel that all these people, the poor ones, they are dragging you behind. I mean, they are stopping your developmental process. And from a Uranian point of view, you may want to disassociate more and more and live in that exclusive neighborhood, not wanting to hear about what goes on in the dark places of the city. You become the classical snob. So what may end up happening is not just that you're a snob, but you can basically engineer a whole structure that will reflect your superiority. And this is why you have cults, that will preach spiritual superiority over, whatever is going on here. I mean, in a classic way, you have a lot of New Agers today that will tell you that, the world will be destroyed and only the good ones will survive. This is a totally Uranian concept that says what? That says that the primitive will be eliminated and we won't have to deal with them. Only the good ones will prevail. It's not very compassionate in that sense. So, in a more brutal way, you have World War II and the desire to eliminate the undesirable. Why? Because they're not fitting the plan of the most exclusive human being, which has to be blonde, tall, whatever. And you will see that a great percentage of Nazi have huge, very strong Aquarian signatures. The desire to build a higher, more sophisticated system. And disassociating with what they call primitive, backwards. So moving into the fifth phase, what happens is that you have to use your genius to go back to the masses. Which means once you pass the test of reality, once your new concepts are integrated and they work, what you do is you go back to the first phase and you upgrade the minimum standard so that the whole society will be able to move forward, not just a few individuals. And that's the greatest challenge. And this is where you have that shift from Uranus to Neptune, because Neptune relates to the masses. Neptune relates to God's creation. Neptune relates to timelessness and to spacelessness, which means to the fact that we are basically all equal from that perspective. So Neptune relates to the street. Neptune relates to the public to the public toilets. Neptune relates to the fact that, we all have a nose and two eyes and go to the restroom once or twice a day. So Uranus is like, no, I don't belong to these people. They are different. They are stupid. They are slower. And Neptune says, you have to adapt. You have to come full circle. So the higher Uranian quality would be to use the mind, to use the sophistication in order to serve the greater whole and not just to benefit minorities. But typically, when you look at the chart, we talked about Uranus being before Pisces, being after Capricorn. Aquarius is naturally squaring Taurus, right? What is Taurus about? Economy, resources. Think about the fact that it's only the elite, Uranus, that benefits from the great majority of the money. Think about the fact that when you have a progressive school, a Uranian school, say the Waldorf school, who teaches the kids to be very creative and incorporate new ways of education, you have to have a lot of money to be able to have your kid in those schools. So this is a typically Uranian concept. What is progressive, what is new, is more expensive very often. And this is why you have social classes. That's the square between Uranus and Taurus. Social classes relate to socio-economic classes. Money relates in many ways to that. But it's not only money, because you also have the intellectual elite, which is not necessarily financial elite. But in many ways, the intellectual elite cannot relate to the mainstream. And this is why, we have the democratic candidates in this country that can be very Uranian in their higher values, but not accessible to the public. So once again, you have a split between mind and emotions. And in another way, what you have, and this is something I encounter a lot in my practice, counseling people. You have many people wanting to become astrologers, wanting to move from their regular job, 9-to-5 job, and wanting to move into the profession of astrology and counseling. And there's a lot of, concern about the fact that people are not signing up and people are not calling me for readings, and how will I make a living? And you will see many astrologers are Uranian. So they are progressing from the 9-to-5 job to having a job that is more spiritual, that is more, opening them up to finer vibration, to less dense qualities. But what happens is that many times these people are not really open to the masses. They don't really open up to include everybody. And they will start saying, well, I can't open so early in the morning, my clinic, or I don't want to deal with this type of people. So you have the mind starting to interfere and putting all these obstructions. Instead of saying, I don't have control, now I'm of service, I have something new to offer, and I have to dedicate myself to that new reality. And once you have that surrendering, suddenly people start to sign up. But if you are afraid of surrendering, if you want to keep your astrology intact, clean, and you don't want to deal with these people that are too weird and have so many problems, you're not going to be accessible. You have that issue of accessibility. So ultimately, the bottom line is, when going through that fifth phase, is being ready to slow down in order for the other ones to catch up. And it's not just a matter of compassion, it's a matter of survival. Why? Why do you need to slow down and allow others to catch up? Why is it a matter of survival? Because if you build an elite that will be very progressive, and this elite doesn't have any contact with the masses, eventually they will be outnumbered, and this means that they will be killed with machete. And you will have 9/11 style events where the masses rebel against the elite minority. Or when you will have continents like Africa who are left behind and forgotten because the Western elite is moving very fast. But then what happens? You have diseases that know no boundaries and do not know who's the elite and who's not, crossing the borders. So helping those that are slower and slowing down the process is a matter of survival. Because ultimately, moving to the next Piscean phase, we're all swimming in the same pool. And we can all, if one is unhappy, everybody ends up being unhappy. But we'll talk further about that in the next lecture. So, questions?
Do you feel that with Uranus and Pisces right now, that perhaps the structure of that hierarchy is going to change to a more Piscean way, without the structure, without the limitations?
Well, one thing to understand is that the structure is absolutely necessary, and if you dissolve it, you don't have a process. Because you need to isolate, you need to be exclusive, you need to be superior. And eventually, only after it is tested and it works, you can reincorporate that and upgrade the standards for everyone. But what I'm saying, it's a natural law to have that separation and to have that hierarchy. We are not born equal, necessarily so, but we can stimulate one another. We can inspire one another. And ultimately, if I'm superior in one field, somebody else will be superior in another field, and we can have an exchange. You have different hierarchies. However, the concept of hierarchy is not absolutely avoidable. You need it. It serves a purpose.
For example, in Los Angeles, they have this philosophy, or not Los Angeles, over the United States, no child left behind, or in the LA Unified School System, giving every child a computer. At some level, we're bringing some equality into the potential to learn in an Aquarian way.
Sure. I mean, that's exactly the fifth phase, when, first of all, you had computer for every child in one school in the country. And, these are the parents that were, could pay, or these were the genius kids that, because they were so sophisticated and so advanced, the government was willing to invest in those very special kids. But now eventually, as these kids were on top of the hierarchy and they were the geniuses, you come to a point where the pyramid has to go back to the roots, and you need to incorporate that now with everybody. So this is a natural phenomenon. So thank you.